Consumer Protection and Commerce. Welcome, Representative Schakowsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm old enough to remember the 1960s movie The Graduate. Dustin Hoffman was the graduate, and I remember at his graduation party, a businessman looked him very seriously in the eye and to give him advice, and he said, plastics, plastics, that's the future. Well, I actually think that certainly the screenwriter was right in predicting that, but I also think that there have been some very devastating consequences. In 2018, about 36 million tons of plastics were generated in the United States, yet less than 10% of the plastics were actually recycled. Instead, we find them in our landfills, in our bodies, in our water, and even in animals' bodies. In the Midwest, nearly 22 million pounds of plastics enter the Great Lakes each year. More than half of that comes into Lake Michigan, which is in my district. And scientists estimate that pound for pound, that there will be more plastic than fish in the oceans in 2050 if we don't do anything about it. So, Mr. Alloway, will recycling alone solve the plastic waste crisis that I believe now exists in the United States today? And I'm going to ask two more questions about that, and you can answer all of them at once. Which common plastic products were in the stream are the most harmful? And finally, are there legitimate alternatives on the horizon to replace these plastics?
Thank you, Representative. To your first question, will recycling alone solve the problem? The answer is no, it cannot. That is impossible. Recycling can make a modest contribution towards reducing these impacts. There are other solutions, including waste prevention. For example, we evaluated the environmental impacts of drinking water out of a single-use PET bottle and recycling it versus drinking tap water in a reusable container and washing it. And even when the impacts of the dishwasher were taken into account, the reusable option was found to be a far superior have far lower environmental impacts. So recycling can be beneficial. However, to be beneficial, it has to be done well. I would point out a recent study in the journal Science Advances, which estimates that the U.S. recycling system itself may be one of this country's largest vectors for contributing plastics into the world's oceans. And that is because of the lack of regulation and accountability at processing facilities and our exports of contaminated bales of materials to other countries who then mistreat them. So recycling can help, but it has to be done well in order to help reduce this problem. To your other questions, which types of plastics are most impactful and are there legitimate alternatives? There are thousands of different types of plastics, and I'm afraid I don't feel qualified at the moment to identify which of those thousands are the most harmful. That's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I apologize. Are there legitimate alternatives? Yes, all materials have alternatives, but I would like to find some common ground with Matt Seaholm and point out that there are instances, there are materials where plastics offer the superior environmental choice, so long as the impacts of the plastic waste is managed appropriately and does not end up in oceans or people's bodies. And that to me seems like the primary challenge here. How do we realize the benefits that plastics can provide while avoiding the negative impacts of plastic production and improper disposal? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that for that answer. I wanted to turn to Ms. Is it Irwin? Let's see. Hold on a second. I guess I just wanted to ask, just 20 companies right now are responsible for most of the production. I wondered if you could suggest how can we ensure that businesses steer away from single use and virgin plastic production?
Great question. Thank you, Congresswoman. So the first thing is the pricing signals. So right now it is much cheaper to source and use virgin plastic as opposed to recycled plastic and other alternatives and other substitutes. That is a large component of the issue.
I appreciate this. It's an issue that we really have to deal with, and I think there's an urgency about it. I thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Representative Johnson, recognized for 5 minutes for questions.